Jennifer, I don't know if you can.
It's recording now.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So that's my cue, I guess. Good evening, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here. As I said earlier, my name is Chiasson-LeBel. I am a former PSAC member. I've contributed to the foundation of CETU, the student employee union at UQAM, a few years ago, I'd say. And yeah, so what in conversation with some PSAC employees, for the training purposes, we decided to craft a presentation about the pink tide in Latin America. The pink tide is this wave of left-leaning governments that took an important space in the continent, essentially in South America, in the continent between 2002 or 3, more or less, until 2015. And the whole reflections about how it contributed to advance workers' rights and what can we learn as a lesson from that. What makes me, this conversation is also informed by the fact that I am doing university research on the topic, and I'll introduce myself as well as a researcher, if you want. And in order to do that, I'll help myself with some slides that you will be able to see in a second. There we go.
Yep.
Excellent. Okay, very good. So the presentation should have the following structure: introduction of the presenter, which is me. I already started, but I'll continue in a second. Then the questions for today. Then I'll give a regional background, and then we'll go through a case study. I'll discuss each of those 4 cases quite briefly, but in a way that makes us understand how the commonalities that I'm trying to draw from this comparison can be understood. And then conclusions is a bit the take-home lessons from this comparison that I would like to present. So as for myself, my name is Chiasson-LeBel. As I said, I finished a PhD in political science at York University in Toronto. This was preceded by a master in sociology at UQAM in Montreal. And I am currently a guest professor at Flacso-Ecuador, a great university in Quito. I am not in Ecuador right now, and I am not teaching there right now, but it's planned that I'm going back in August to continue teaching. And yes, so it is based on a part of my own research for my dissertation and postdoc that I am informing this talk, but I also made separate readings and research specifically for this presentation. If you want, as a good academic, I need to introduce myself also by presenting some of the stuff that I wrote. If you want to have a view on the kind of reflections that are related to the discussion for today, I contributed to this number that I actually co-edited of the ERLAX. ERLAX is the European Reviews of Latin American and Caribbean Studies. If you put that in Google, you will easily find it. And it's the issue 108 that was published in December 2019. And I have a few articles there, and articles that are related to the topic that we'll discuss today. What is the topic that we'll discuss today is, so this pink tide, this wave of left-leaning governments that were elected in Latin America, most of them have left power, either because of weird circumstances of different institutional abiding levels. What inheritance have they left? Are unions and popular movements in a better position after than they were before or during the time the left was in power? Are labor rights better protected now than they were before? And how could unions better use the time during which the left is in power to improve their situation? It's a bit the kind of reflection that I wanted to bring about. So the idea is to, of course, know better and travel travel during this pandemic where we're stuck at home and we cannot travel. So use this opportunity to travel a bit to South America. Nevertheless, I think the whole idea of comparing cases is trying to draw some lessons that can also inform our reflections on how we do things here. As a regional background, which I think is necessary to understand on what were the left government standing, a few considerations. First of all, we talk about the 1980s in Latin America as having been the last decade. This expression, this expression was coined actually by ECLAC, which is the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. Because during the 1980s, after the debt crisis that was caused by transition in the macroeconomic policy of the United States, the debt was pressing so much in Latin America that if you look for the decade of 1980, what you get is that you have negative economic growth, which eventually impacted very hard on all those countries. And with the fiscal pressure also exerted by the debt, it resulted in neoliberal, the beginning of a neoliberal turn that was supported also by international financial institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, that were pressing for structural adjustment programs and created this cauldron of neoliberalism at the time. Nevertheless, we need also to remember that this happened as the continent was also going through a democratic transition. For most countries of South America during the 1970s have gone through a certain time of dictatorship. Dictatorship that ended in late 1970s, early 1980s. So this turn of decade was a mix of those two experiences, and eventually led to what followed in the 1990s, which is a neoliberal turn that, in spite of the fact that there was this democratic transition, so this return to democracy, the issue was that the neoliberal policies were adopted often in ways that were not expected by the electoral result, that were not announced by the electoral result, what we call neoliberalism by surprise. For instance, in Venezuela and Argentina, these are two clear cases where the candidates who imposed the neoliberal shift hadn't campaigned on the fact that this is what they were going to do. So it was kind of a really surprising turn. In other cases, it's a bit more complex, but therefore the neoliberal term was really rarely democratically chosen. And it was presented as the only solution possible at the time. There was a strong ideological support. Some people talk of the Washington consensus to describe the neoliberal policies that were adopted at the time. And the consensus was obviously not the consensus of everybody. It was essentially the consensus of the institution located in Washington that were allocating funds to face the financial crisis in Latin America, but also in Africa and Asia at the time. So this consensus was really partial. Nevertheless, in terms of macroeconomic policy, it had a stringent impact. One of the promise of this consensus was that labor flexibilization and labor flexibilization reform would increase productivity and therefore, incidentally, increase and improve prosperity. This would reduce informal work, and by reducing informal work, make the condition of workers better, therefore contribute to reduce poverty and inequality, but also would increase employment and reduce unemployment parallelly. But the whole promise that was coming there is if it's easier to hire and fire people, then investors will feel comfortable to hire people, and therefore, if the conditions are good, they will hire more people, and this will lead to better growth. Overall, when we look at the raw data that I have not provided here, but we could I could have done that, but I decided I was not going to spend too much time on this period there. But overall, it's a total failure, at least on those promises of increasing prosperity, reducing informal labor, increasing employment, and reducing poverty and inequality. Especially for the last two, it was a failure. The only place where the neoliberal reforms have been effective is to control inflation. And inflation was indeed an important problem at the time. But on the other end, all the other promises were not fulfilled. And this is because all the other promises were not fulfilled that it was also received very bitterly by popular sectors, popular classes that were organized in different ways, notably in unions, but not also, and we'll discuss that a bit more in detail later on. But there was a very, and this is important to underline, in the 1980s, late 1980s and 1990s, there was an important popular resistance to the neoliberal turn that was imposed in different countries. This is an image, the first image here that you can see on top is an image of the 1989 Caracazo in Venezuela, where the president, Carlos Andrés Pérez, was elected with the support of the main union, the CTV, and on the promise and the expectation that he would bring back the prosperity of the 1970s when the oil embargo had actually created the wealth of Venezuela, because Venezuela is an oil-producing country. What happened is that once Carlos Andrés Pérez was elected in 1989 for the second time, he rapidly signed a letter of intent with the IMF, and one of the things that was contained in that letter was that he should increase the price of gas at the pump, which is always something that is contentious in a country where you produce oil. But then there was a mismatch with the way they managed the reform, notably in how they would increase on one side the price of oil for of gas for gasoline for buses, but would not allow buses to increase the fare. So the bus drivers, mostly for private routes, disagreed with that and increased the fares. And then it created riots that lasted for, I think, about 10 days. And the military came to pacify the situation, which resulted in a dire account of deaths that, according to the reports, range between 300 and 3,000. And it's hard to have the appropriate number here, but certainly an important popular uprising opposing the neoliberal reform. In other cases, we can think of the Zapatista uprising in Mexico as well in 1994. In this case, it was also linked to the signature of the North America Free Trade Agreement, and to the fact that this had the signature of the free trade agreement had also come with a modification of the constitution that was directly affecting the capacity of indigenous community to rely on a communal form of property. And this was also something that created the attack on the communal form of land property, had caused the uprising by indigenous movement in Ecuador in 1984. But along with unions in Ecuador, they also had important uprisings and protests in 1997, causing the president to leave, and also in 2000, when the liberalization of finance had created a banking crisis that resulted in an economic crisis that also made a very important push for citizens to go abroad and try to earn money abroad. A wave of migration that is comparable to the wave of migration that we see currently from Venezuelan citizens out of their country. So the imposition of neoliberalism had created a lot of protest in different ways. In late 2001, in Argentina, the protest also led the president to resign, and under the motto or the chant "Que se vayan todos," which means that they should all leave power, because the way they managed the economy led to this to worsening of the economic crisis, and when they essentially during the 1990s, and we'll go a bit deeper into that later on, but they had pegged the value of the pesos on the American dollars, and when they removed this this equivalence, the value of the peso completely evaporated, and by doing so, people lost their savings. Other protests in Bolivia were very important, and at the same time, this slowly led to a form of globalization of resistance that most of us will remember, because we were politically born in this moment, which is the globalization of resistance from anti-globalization to alter-globalization with the World Social Forums, and this wave of internationalization of resistance to neoliberalism. What I wanted to underline here is that this neoliberal turn was very rarely adopted in democratic ways, was rather imposed by covert means, and popular organization, indigenous movements, and union rejected this turn and its effect. And this is what led to what allows today's talk, which is the wave of post-neoliberal governance. So here, what I put on the right is a map that shows the different countries that elected left-leaning governments between 2002 and 2014. And now you can see how much of South America was covered by this wave. So Venezuela started with the election of Hugo Chávez. Here you have Ecuador on the Pacific coast, the tiny country squeezed between Colombia, that was never part of the wave, and Peru. Peru has not been part of the wave exactly. We'll see what happens in the next round of the election, because they had April 11, they had the first round of the presidential election, and there's a weird left-wing candidate that is run ahead in the poll. So we'll see how it goes in next, I think it's June 6th, the next round of the election. Here we have Bolivia with Evo Morales that was elected in 2006. Brazil, of course, the big country in the middle here. Brazil, where Lula was elected in 2002. And Argentina in 2003 with Kirchner. Paraguay, that knew a very short-lived left-leaning governments of Fernando Lugo between 2009 and 2012, if I'm not wrong, that was ousted by a parliamentary coup, and Uruguay as well, Uruguay by the Gulf de la Plata here. So you had, therefore, what is this wave? Is a wave of parties that were surfing on the anti-neoliberal protest. Most of them were not exactly socialist when they came to power, and that's important to underline, because a lot of the discourse is about how they were socialist, therefore failure in the north, especially what we receive as a discourse. But in most cases, even in the case of Venezuela, initially those governments were not claiming to be socialist at the very beginning. It's only in the case of Venezuela, it's only in 2005 that there was really assertive moves by Chávez, changing the name of his party and asserting that he was going to follow a socialist path. Most of the other countries, the leaders were not exactly claiming to do a socialist turn at the time of their election. So this post-neoliberal wave was also more or less, this is the symbol that I put here, more or less organically linked to the movements that had led the protest. Organization and unions that had opposed the neoliberal turn sometimes were supportive, sometimes were not. In the case of, we'll discuss that a bit more in details, but in some cases it's there are clear links. But in other cases, like in Ecuador and Venezuela, the link is much blurrier. Those governments, they to a great extent relied on the recovery of the ownership over underground natural resources. Here I'm talking about mining resources, oil, or mining like minerals, in order to capture the rent that comes from those resources and redistribute them in a way that would pacify the social conflicts by redistribution, and attempted to direct the economic development away from this resource dependency. There was a certain amount of success with that wave. If we look at the raw data, what we see is that there was a real poverty reduction and reduction of inequalities in the countries that were governed by the pink tide for the period at least until 2014. Of course, the 2008-2009 crisis dented a bit that good results. Nevertheless, the world economic crisis really hit later the region starting in 2014. There were nevertheless some failures in their attempts. As they were not socialist, those governments were mostly attempting to use public investment as a way to foster private investment in a way that would, as I said, steer their economy away from resource dependency. What we see in many of those cases is that there was a failure to, maybe I should put a parenthesis with the Brazilian case here, but the capitalist classes refused to really invest and follow the lead of those states that were attempting to develop a more inward-looking development, and the dependency continues. So this is a list. What I've put here is a list of all the governments that were considered to be part of this tide. I'm not going to go through each of those cases one by one. It's a bit long, but it just gives you an idea of the different leaders and parties that were part of it. And here I put also the column when the return of the right happened, with it's color coded here because in the green cases, it's cases where the left lost in elections, in electoral processes, and in the red cases, it's when it's a much more dodgy change. In the case of Bolivia, for instance, there was a military coup in 2019, but we can discuss that later because the Bolivian case is not exactly included in the comparative chart that I want to present. So, as I said, the question is this wave. How has this wave contributed to solidify the labor capacity to defend its right, but also to advance the workers' right? So in order to study this, what I offer as a mean of reflecting on that is a comparative case study where we look at the relationship between unions and post-neoliberal governments in different, according to different axes. I've chose the case. I chose cases that, according to two main factors. One is where there is an historical linkage between left-leaning parties and the main unions in question. In the case of Argentina, for instance, there is a historical relationship between the main union CGT and the Peronist party, PJ or Partido Justicialista. In Brazil, the foundation of the main union that we'll discuss today, the CUT, and the Workers' Party happened at the same time in 1983. And actually, the main leader of the first presidential candidate of the PT, the Partido de los Trabajadores, the left-leaning party, comes from a history of union activism. And then we have two other cases where there was a late foundation of left-leaning parties. What do I mean by late foundation is that those parties were founded a few months before the election of that led their leader to become president, and therefore there's no history of organic linkages with grassroots organization. It's much faster, and then the linkages between the movements and the party are of a different nature. In Ecuador, there was nevertheless a deal that was signed between the main union, which is not actually a union, it's a common front of unions, and Rafael Correa, Alianza País, before his election. And in Venezuela, there was actually tension between the main union, CTV, and Chávez's party, the Movimiento Quinta República, MVR. But I'll go a bit more in details about those cases in a second. And there's three axes of comparison here. First, that you'll see coming back case after case, as the reforms that those governments have enacted protected workers' rights, or as it improved the protection of workers' rights, as it protected the freedom of organization, and as it strengthened labor unions, and as the integration within government and the state been improved in a way that would favor workers. So that's a bit what I want to do on a country-by-country basis. So we start with Argentina, our first case. As I said, there is a historical linkage between the Peronist Party and the Partido Justicialista and the CGT, the main labor organization. Actually, in the 1940s, after a coup, Perón became Minister of Labor before becoming the president, and he was intermittently the president, Juan Domingo Perón, who's the leader of the historic leader of the PJ, would be the Peronist Party. The Peronist Party takes its names from Perón. And there was actually in the 1940s the establishment of a corporatist form of linkages between the union and the state. That means that actually the state was sanctioning certain organization to be the representative of the sectoral representative of workers, and centralizing negotiations by sector, and organizing therefore this from the state in certain sectoral negotiation that were organized by the state, therefore favoring specific corporatist linkage between the state and those unions. There was, in spite of this historic alliance, the Peronist Party did elected the president that Carlos Menem in 1989 that imposed the neoliberal term by surprise. And then I noted, as I was reviewing all the readings, all the laws that were adopted during the 1990s that had a negative impact on labor rights. There were, at the time, late 1980s and early 1990s, the country was experiencing a very harsh inflation crisis. So that's why they pegged the peso on the dollar, but also then they adopted other measures to try and stimulate economic growth in the context and favor the employer's capacity to adapt to the situation. So they offered a possibility to defer some wage payments. They make short-term contract easier, reduce employers' monetary obligation, extended probation, apprenticeship without employer's responsibility, long-term internship in order to reduce employer's responsibility. So the list is very long. One of the important of reforms that they adopted in the 1990s in order to flexibilize labor, one of the important things was to decentralize bargaining. Branch bargaining is common to corporatist systems. So instead of negotiating each local place by local place, you would negotiate by branch, like all the teachers would negotiate, all this kind of workers would negotiate at the same time together. And decentralizing bargaining was at that time something that would weaken the capacity of workers to maintain their condition. This turn was special because, as I said, originally Carlos Menem was a representative of the party that has a strong link to the union, so it caused a split. The CGT was divided in several factions in the late 1980s. Eventually, they will reunite against those neoliberal reforms in the 1990s. But one faction actually created a new organization, the CTA, in 1992. And I think it's important to underline here that at the time, because of this turmoil, the CTA created new form to integrate organization for unemployed and informal workers within their own structure. So here we have a union that facing the dire economic situation, decides to renew its processes, to integrate space for workers who lose their job inside of the union, so that what they represent is not just the employees that have good conditions, but also those who lost their condition and find ways together to fight for everybody's to improve their condition. And I think this is important to underline because it will also have an impact on what follows. And what parallel to that, you had the multiplication of other informal workers' organization together. Informal workers' organization and unemployed workers' organization make this kind of wide sector that we called the piqueteros, which are known for their protest where they were picketing by the side of the road. That's why they are called piqueteros. So in 2001 and late 2001, early 2002, the economic crisis had reached a very important level. And in December 2001, unions collectively called for mobilization against some of the measure that had been adopted by the president. And this stirred up protests that went way over and beyond the call of the sole unions. De la Rua, the president at the time, called for the police to pacify the situation. It ended up in I think 35 deaths after the first night, and then protest wouldn't stop, and eventually it forced De la Rua to leave. And this, in a chain of events that I'm going over very quickly, led eventually to the election of Nestor Kirchner in 2003, who was also a Peronist, but contrarily to Menem, was not originally supported by the CGT, but was supported by the CTA. What we see here is that he was elected and became part of what we call the pink tide, but at the beginning, it wasn't clear, and therefore that he was going to help the workers. Therefore, he had to gain the confidence and the support from workers. And since he needed to gain labor support, he did enacted some interesting reforms at the time. So in terms of protection of worker rights, the literature agrees that there was a withdrawal of most of the flexibilization measures that were adopted in the 1990s. In exchange, obviously, it was expected that the labor leaders would moderate the wage demands by workers. The freedom of organization and union strengthening laws, the second axis on which I'm comparing them, there was at the time the reestablishment of sectoral negotiations, something very important in order to strengthen the negotiation capacity of labor. There was also the support to the union managed healthcare system, obras sociales, something that historically gives structural power to unions because they also manage some of their own access to healthcare services. And there was officially the recognition of different federation and their splits because the CDA was not originally recognized by the state. It took a while, and then eventually later on it was. Integration to state and government was originally mostly of organization from the informal sector, and essentially what we see is that the integration gives better result and is stronger when the government needs to gain the support of workers, when it's not taken for granted, and when it's taken for granted, like in Christina's second term, because after Nestor Kirchner got power, his wife was elected in 2007 and then again in 2011. And so what you had is the creation of this kind of need to attract the support of labor meant that the government did do the right things in order to improve their condition. The balance sheet is that you had gains in this context when unions were not taken for granted. And eventually, this also led the unions to support the government, notably against landlords' protest in 2008, in a conflict where the government was trying to increase the taxes on the export of certain products, notably soy, an important staple. And so it in exchange of this overturning the neoliberal turns, they were gaining the support from workers. So this is the balance sheet for the first case. Neoliberalism in Brazil occurred in a very different context. First, you also have, in this case, historical corporatism that was established by a military government in the military, well, inspired government, to make it simple, in the 1940s. The state collected the union dues, central state, and then redistributed it according to the recognized union, which was also making that the mobilization and strikes were very difficult until 1985, which is not surprising because between 1964 and 1985, there was actually a military dictatorship. So it's in the turn, the democratic transition that just before actually the democratic transition, that you had the foundation of the CUT, the central, the Worker Central, and the Partido dos Trabalhadores, that would essentially be very important actor in the push to end the dictatorship. And they were actually able, as unions, to mobilize and slow down the first neoliberal waves in 1985, 1994. And already in 1989, Lula, Luis Ignacio Lula da Silva, which comes from a background of union militancy, became the candidate from the PT and was a viable presidential candidate. Then, eventually, in 1994, you have the election of Fernando Henrique Cardoso, which appear on this picture, but this picture, I think, is more from the 1970s, when he was a renowned Marxist for his writing on the dependency theory. He imposed a sharp neoliberal turn, in which he notably called the military to repress oil workers on strike that were opposing the privatization of oil exploitation, something that is not small in a country that was just getting out of the military dictatorship. His politics was very efficient at decreasing union density, but not necessarily by official means, but by covert means. He was able to maintain the union rates fairly low. He imposed some reform packages in 1994 until 1998 and 2000 that really created some flexibilization of wages, made hiring and firing easier, favored temporary hires and suspension of contract, reduced the state role in arbitration of conflicts, and also reduced the role of unions in the defense of grievances, making workers more responsible for those kind of individual workers, more in charge of those grievances, which eventually makes them weaker in this kind of situation. And so this led to the election of Lula in 2003, who became president, but he never had the legislative majority on of his own. He was always able to make legislative gains by making alliances with other left, right, and center-right parties. And this leads us, therefore, to the post-neoliberal wave. And what do we see here? Lula, when he was a young president. In terms of protection of workers' rights, we have an important measures for informal workers. A lot of state redistributive measures, like the program Fomecero and Bolsa Familia. So these programs are important in order to increase the access to the basics. Nevertheless, they are not necessarily something that favors the capacity of organization. It's essentially direct and conditional cash transfer. You have important increase in minimum wage, but the flexibilization measure, most of the flexibilization measure that were adopted under Cardoso were not reversed. And you have, as a result of the economic condition, a formalization of employment, but not exactly a formalization of employment because of the transformation of the labor laws. Essentially, after that, you had regarding freedom of organization and strengthening union strengthening laws, you have really attempts to favor labor organization and collective bargaining that were mostly blocked by the Congress. So eventually, the attempt from the PT to move on those fronts were little successful. There was an exception on the withdrawal of some corporatist constraint on unions that made the recognition of CUT's role, the main union, easier. And you have also the reintroduction, the introduction of unions' role in at the bargaining table, which is something very important because prior to that, it's only the local member of the union that could go at the bargaining table. They couldn't sit with representative of the central union, meaning that they had less collective support in those contexts. And integration of to state and government was eventually very high because the CUT and the PT were really close by organization, and the CUT was essentially a training school for the PT and the government. And nevertheless, it led to weak mobilization on the ground, except in support of the government. So the balance sheet is mixed. Important gains in terms of state redistribution, but more in those terms than in increasing the organization capacity of unions. Unions are taken for granted, essentially because they are really member of the governing coalition, and demands are sacrificed, labor demands are often sacrificed on the altar of the greater political project, which is to maintain the party in power. And increasingly what we see, and especially in 2012, 2013, is that other forms of organization are channeling popular disgruntlement. So the role of unions is sidestepped in terms of voicing discontent. To go quickly over the case of Ecuador, we have here a case of partial corporatism. Partial corporatism because it was also imposed by a military government. Nevertheless, the industrialization was really reduced. So what made the union movement much more important as a political actor was less this capacity to negotiate in different plants than its capacity to mobilize, because the different unions forged together a united front in the early 1990s, the FUT, and that became also a key actor in struggling against neoliberalism in the 1980s. This spawned the 13 general strikes, and in the 1980s, they are really the ones that are able to disturb the political scenario. They were nevertheless greatly weakened in 1991 by a bill, Bill 133, that doubled the minimal number of workers that were necessary to form a union, from 15 to 30, if I'm not wrong. But in a country where most of the economy is in small and medium businesses, this was really a hard blow on unions. And also this bill was prohibiting social strikes, and was created that there was a drastic drop in the number of collective agreements and the number of unions that were formed at the time. Nevertheless, indigenous movements, parallelly to that dire situation for unions, indigenous movements were taking a leading role in the class struggle. In alliance, both produce important, and both with unions, they produced important movement of resistance. Most clearly in 1997, and in 2005, it was certainly more the union movement. And in 2005, it's a bit more of a mixed bag of citizen disgruntlement that led to the protest that hosted the president. But those three dates are important because they are the dates where the uprising led to the president's to abandon power. And this led to the election of Rafael Correa in 2006, part of the Pink Tide. And originally, in the very first years, the FUT proudly supported Correa and took part to the Constituent Assembly, and was expecting that this would lead to an improvement in labor condition. Nevertheless, when we look at the balance of the years of government of Rafael Correa, what we see is that in terms of the protection of workers' rights, there is good language in the constitution. There is a government that was indeed supportive of workers, notably in specific conflict with private businesses, and even against some decision of administrative tribunals, the government seemed to go out of its way to really support the workers in terms of their negotiation with private employers. Nevertheless, in the public sector, we have a very different scenario, where we have scattering attacks against public sector workers. Already in the Constitutional Assembly, you had the constitutional orders number 2 and number 4 that introduced max wages and maxed the severance, introduced maximum to the severance payments that could be paid. So you already had use of the Constitutional Assembly, and in order to for the government to gain more control over the public sector. And the decree number 813 was adopted in 2011, if I'm not wrong, and it authorized the mandatory resignation by buying out, essentially a mean of getting rid of public employees when they were deemed unfit for what the government was expecting them to do. So this shows you that at this level, really the situation was not in terms of workers' rights, was not as good as one could expect. In terms of freedom of organization and union strengthening laws, what we have is that instead of strengthening the capacity of workers to autonomously organize and determine their union, what we have is the support of the splitting of existing organization in order to create subservient union. Correa himself attended the foundation of the public sector union, the CSTPA, in 2011. There was also in the informal worker federations moments when the government interfered in order to favor subservient unions. So what we have here is the integration to state and government that is weak, institutional reforms, even to the tripartite commission that was in charge of determining the sectoral minimum wage, where you have the integration of more labor representation that ended up meaning in the end that they lose power for a tricky thing of the law that I won't get into the detail here. But eventually the balance sheet here is mixed negative, because what we have is the paternalistic protection of the state as long as the state stays in control of what is going on. And you have a division of organization in a weakening way for the autonomous power of workers. And the gains are, again, here mostly related to state redistribution. And the last case that I wanted to cover here is Venezuela, where you had a partially corporatist setting, but you had a very centralized union until the early 2000s. The CTV was essentially the only union that was really, well, there were other federations, but they were like covering, I think, 80%, 85% of the unionized workforce. And the CTV was very tightly linked with the AD, Acción Democrática, the party that will eventually do the neoliberal turn by surprise in 1989 and would lead to the buses being turned over, as you saw earlier on the slides, under the presidency of Carlos Andrés Pérez. Again, here it's a neoliberal turn by surprise, because he was not elected on that program at all, but enacted neoliberal reforms sharply as he entered in office. And initially, the CTV was unable to react effectively. After the riots in 1989, the reaction was slow to take form. Eventually, they called a strike several months later. But eventually, what happened is that if they were able to slow down the labor flexibilization reforms that Carlos Andrés Pérez was attempting to impose at the time, it was essentially because the turn that Pérez had taken was making him having a hard time to maintain support from his party. Therefore, concession to labor was an attempt to stay in power. But this caused the whole party system to collapse. What I mean there by party system to collapse is that it was a bipartite system where two parties were exchanging power since the 1970s, but in 1983, a new formed party won, and the party system, this bipartite system, eventually evaporated. So then this resulted from a situation where the union legitimacy was really weakening, and through privatization, they lost a lot of membership through the reduction of work position. And eventually, by the end of the decade, they were retroceding on many elements, including the severance payment, and they accepted the privatization of Social Security at the time. So the election of Hugo Chávez and his staunch rejection of neoliberalism was therefore rejection not only of the neoliberal program, but was also a critique of how the union were unable to oppose this kind of situation, since they were defending, they were entrenched in their former party linkages. What happened after the election of Chávez, which I put a picture of him here, is that in terms of protection of workers, right, you had important constitutional gains, but you have early confrontation of, again, in the public sector, but in this case in the oil sector, which is a state-dominated sector. And again, when we review how the protection of workers work, what we found a very paternalistic and politically interested attitude of the government trying to defend labor when it suits its political needs. The freedom of organization and the union strengthening laws is here really weak. We have instead very early on an intrusion of in the choice of union leaders. For instance, Chávez summoned a national referendum where everybody in the country could vote in order to decide whether it was necessary to replace the union leadership of CTV. So you had an intrusion of the executive power and the union freedom. Of course, you had a lot of members of those unions that were saying that the leadership was illegitimate, but by doing that, it created a weird scenario, and eventually where the state was, state intrusion was determining who was going to be the union leader, and it led to the formation of a new confederation, the UNT, that attempted to maintain its autonomy between 2003 and 2009. But in 2000, no, I think it's 2009, but I'm not exactly sure of the specific year. You had the foundation of loyal and subservient central to the executive power, the CBST, Central Bolivariana Socialista de Trabajadores, and then by attracting most important union in this public sector becomes very important. Integration of the state to state and government is fairly high. I mean, the president and the minister of labor, the current president Maduro and the minister of labor are former union members and union activists. Nevertheless, the agenda that they defend is far from being an autonomous power of workers, but rather the subservient organization of workers in order to serve another political project that then we can discuss, of course, if it's positive or not, but you don't have an autonomous power, very much autonomous power there. And therefore, I tag this as being a negative balance sheet because you have little autonomy left to popular organization, and the gains depend upon the loyalty to Chavismo. And what we have here, therefore, is the international. I need to add something here in order to qualify this balance sheet, which is that the international context of confrontation goes a long way also to explain the bad result of the situation, because there was a coup attempt in 2002. There were intense pressure of the US all the time that creates a context in which, of course, the loyalty of the partisan loyalty becomes very important in order to be able to resist to such pressure. But instead of being based on the autonomous capacity of workers, it's based on the loyalty to Chavismo as a political project. So I did all this comparison in order to help us think about a few general conclusions that I think can be helpful also in other contexts. And the first conclusion I would like to underline here is that labor flexibilization does not always happen through legal reforms, as we have seen in the neoliberal context. What do I mean there is that it can be also the indirect results of the change in the socio-political and economic climate that makes workers accept to worsen their condition by themselves. So here, labor flexibilization is not only a legal question, it's also a question of the balance of power with the employers, and therefore maintaining a positive balance of power for workers is also important in very different contexts. And that being said, also, the reverse is also true, that the improvement in labor condition is not always the result of legislative changes. It can also be the result of changes in the economic conditions. Between 2002 and 2012, overall, South America has known a very positive economic context by the growing demand for primary resources. So therefore, this helped also to improve labor conditions. Therefore, the question is, how should the labor movement do in order for those gains to be entrenched and be entrenched enough that they help to resist the end of the upward economic cycle. So that should be a goal for unions in order for their gains to persist over time. Another conclusion that I draw from the observation is that if unions do not take care of adapting their structure to the evolving forms of exploitation, notably informal labor, notably and autonomous labor, I'll come back in a second on this, other organizations will form, and this will offer the possibility for different governments to pit different sectors against one another. So I think here what I want to underline is what I was mentioning about the CTR in Argentina and its integration of different forms of organizing unemployed laborers, and is the fact that increasingly we have forms of labors that are evolving. Obviously the industrial 8 to 5 form of labor is still very important, but it's not the only one. And we have a growing sector of labor that is informal, that we call it informal in Latin America, but here in the North, we could also call it autonomous labor in very many instances. And the question is, how can union contribute to organize those workers in a way that would not allow the political system to take advantage of the competition that there is between autonomous labor and unionized labor, and create greater unity at this level. So I think this calls for the need to evolve and respond to this evolution. Also, one of the another conclusion is that left governments were eventually not very good at developing laws and that would entrench and the development of autonomous labor organization. You had some more of that in the cases of Argentina and maybe the case of Brazil as well. But overall, in the 4 cases, it's not extremely strong and disappointingly weak for left-leaning government, I would say. And what that means, just to come back on this for a second, what that means is that when conservative governments came to power, then eventually labor was not in a strong position in order to resist. And that also explains how one of the first things that the right-wing government did, for instance, in Brazil, after they did the institutional coup against Dilma Rousseff, how they passed very rapidly a reform to discipline labor again. Another conclusion is that the unconditional partisan support is unlikely to yield positive results for labor movement and union strengthening. When ties are too strong between the party and the union, what we see is that instead of meaning that labor is going to have formal gains, that if they are unions are taken for granted, therefore the political movement will be for the governments to try and seek support from other sectors. Nevertheless, frontal opposition to a left-leaning party is neither the right solution, of course, especially in the process of state renewal. In Venezuela, this has also given very bad results for the CTV. So what that leads me to, this observation leads me to conclude by comparing the four cases with the importance of the autonomy of the labor movement as a movement that has the capacity to press for an agenda that will institutionalize gains for working people before, during, and after a left government takes power. And also, the support to political party needs to be very conditional to their capacity to deliver those gains. And also the importance to never neglect to develop, maintain, and feed the capacity to mobilize the membership in active political movements. And finally, the return of right-wing government is bound to happen. So the importance is not only to make immediate gains during the left, but to institutionalize advances that will favor the organization capacity when the right-leaning governments will come back to power. These are the main conclusions that I draw from this comparison, and I hope you found this presentation informative. And now we can go to a discussion period if you'd like.
Well, thank you very much, Thomas, for your presentation. I think it was very enlightening, especially on the question of the autonomy of the labor unions vis-a-vis the political parties, and eventually some left-wing government here in our country. And also, and it's interesting, even though it's other countries, other dynamics, it's interesting to see what can and what could be done here in areas such as union organizing, or in order to energize the union and more broadly the North American social movements. So before going on to the discussion, I will just remind our viewers that our informal discussion won't be recorded, but feel free to leave your comments on our different social platforms. And so the recording will end in a couple of seconds, and after that we'll go to the